The morning rush at Chicago O'Hare Airport was in full swing. Travelers hurried past each other with rolling suitcases and coffee cups, everyone focused on catching their flights. Among them, a quiet figure moved slowly through the bustling terminal. Harold Martinez, 78 years old, walked carefully toward the business-class check-in counter. His steps were measured, his back slightly bent from years of hard work. He wore a simple gray sweater that had seen better days, dark pants with a small patch on one knee, and worn black shoes that he'd polished that morning until they shone as best they could. In his weathered hands, he clutched a boarding pass and his old wallet. The suitcase beside him had traveled many miles. Its corners were scuffed, and a piece of silver tape held one side together. But Harold didn't mind. It had served him well for 20 years, and he saw no reason to replace something that still worked. As he approached the business-class counter, Harold noticed the stark difference between himself and the other passengers in line. There was a woman in an expensive suit talking loudly on her phone about a $1 million deal. Behind her stood a man wearing a Rolex watch that caught the terminal lights. Their luggage was pristine, their clothes pressed and perfect. Harold took his place in line, patiently waiting his turn. When the woman in the suit finished her transaction, she glanced back at him with a confused frown. The man with the Rolex whispered something to his companion, and they both looked in Harold's direction before walking away. Finally, it was Harold's turn. He stepped forward to the counter where Linda Patterson, the check-in supervisor, was sorting through papers. She was a woman in her 40s with perfectly styled hair and a crisp uniform. She looked up at Harold and immediately her expression changed. "Excuse me, sir," Linda said, not bothering to smile. "I think you might be lost. The economy check-in is over there." She pointed toward a crowded area across the terminal. Harold gently placed his boarding pass on the counter. "Good morning. I have a business-class ticket for Flight 447 to Seattle." Linda barely glanced at the boarding pass. Instead, she looked Harold up and down, taking in his simple clothes and old suitcase. "Sir, I'm sure there's been some mistake. This is the business-class counter." "Yes, I know," Harold said softly. "My ticket says business class, seat 4A. Other passengers in line began to notice the conversation. A young businessman behind Harold checked his expensive watch impatiently. Two women in designer clothes whispered to each other, shooting glances toward the counter. Linda finally picked up Harold's boarding pass, but she held it like it might be contaminated. She examined it closely, turning it over in her hands. "Where did you get this ticket?" she asked, her voice filled with suspicion. "I bought it from your website 3 weeks ago," Harold replied calmly. "I have the confirmation email on my phone if you'd like to see it." "Sir, business class tickets cost over $2,000. Are you sure you didn't accidentally print someone else's boarding pass?" The line behind Harold was growing longer. People were getting restless. The young businessman made an exaggerated sigh. "Come on," he muttered. "Some people." Harold felt heat rise in his cheeks, but he kept his voice steady. "I saved up for this ticket. It's for a very special trip. My granddaughter is graduating from medical school." Linda called over her colleague, David Chen, who managed the business class desk. David was younger, in his 30s, and usually handled difficult situations. He approached the counter with a professional smile that quickly faded when he saw Harold. "What seems to be the problem?" David asked Linda, though he was looking directly at Harold with barely concealed doubt. "This gentleman claims he has a business class ticket," Linda explained, handing David the boarding pass. David studied the ticket more carefully than Linda had. He typed something into his computer, frowned, and typed again. "The ticket appears to be legitimate in our system," he said quietly to Linda. But instead of helping Harold, Linda crossed her arms. "Well, our system has been having issues lately. There have been reports of people finding fake tickets online." "Ma'am," Harold said, his patience beginning to wear thin, "I can show you my credit card statement, my confirmation email, everything you need." The businessman behind Harold spoke up loudly. "Look, can we move this along? Some of us have important meetings to catch." "Seriously," agreed one of the women in designer clothes. "This is ridiculous." Linda seemed to gain confidence from the other passengers' complaints. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside. I think there's been a misunderstanding with your ticket purchase." Harold's heart sank. He had worked extra shifts for months to afford this ticket. He had cleaned office buildings until midnight, then woke up early to work his day job. Every dollar had been precious, saved carefully in an old coffee tin in his kitchen. This trip meant everything to him. "Please," Harold said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just check your computer again. My confirmation number is right here." But Linda had already decided. She gestured toward two airport security officers who were walking nearby. "Officers, could you help us with the situation here?" The security officers approached the counter. They were polite but firm. "Is there a problem?" asked the older officer named Rodriguez. "This gentleman is claiming to have a business class ticket, but we believe there may be some confusion," Linda explained, speaking about Harold as if he weren't standing right there. Officer Rodriguez looked at Harold with kind eyes. "Sir, can I see your ID and boarding pass?" Harold handed over his documents. Rodriguez examined them carefully, comparing the name on the ID to the boarding pass. Everything matched perfectly. "The documents look legitimate," Rodriguez told Linda. But Linda wasn't giving up. "We've had problems with fraudulent tickets lately. I think it would be best if he flies economy and we sort this out later." The crowd behind Harold was growing impatient. More passengers were joining the line and the whispers were getting louder. Harold could hear fragments of their conversations. "Why is this taking so long? He obviously doesn't belong in business class. Look at that suitcase, this is embarrassing." Harold felt smaller with each comment. This wasn't how he had imagined starting his journey to see his granddaughter graduate. He had pictured himself walking confidently to his business class seat, finally able to travel in comfort for once in his life. "Sir," Officer Rodriguez said gently to Harold, "would you be willing to take an economy seat for today? The airline can work out any issues with your ticket later." Harold looked at the long line of impatient passengers, at Linda's stern face, at David, who was avoiding eye contact. He thought about causing a scene, about fighting for what was rightfully his. But he had never been one to make trouble. "I suppose that would be okay," Harold said quietly, his shoulders sagging with defeat. Linda immediately brightened. "Wonderful. David, please arrange an economy seat for this gentleman." As David typed into his computer, Harold carefully folded his boarding pass and put it back in his wallet. He picked up his old suitcase and prepared to walk across the terminal to the economy section. The businessman behind him finally stepped forward with visible relief. "Thank goodness," he said to his companion, not bothering to lower his voice. "I was starting to think we'd miss our flight." Harold paused for just a moment, looking back at the business class counter. Then he walked slowly toward the economy check-in area, his dignity intact despite everything that had just happened. Harold walked slowly through the airplane aisle, checking seat numbers as he went. The economy section was packed with travelers, and the narrow walkway made it difficult for him to maneuver with his old suitcase. Other passengers squeezed past him, some muttering under their breath about the delay. When he finally found his row, Harold's heart sank a little more. His assigned seat was 32B, the dreaded middle seat. On one side sat a large man in a business suit who had already claimed both armrests and was typing furiously on his laptop. On the other side was a woman with headphones on, scrolling through her phone, completely absorbed in her own world. Harold politely asked the businessman if he could get to his seat. The man looked up with obvious annoyance, barely moving his legs to let Harold squeeze by. As Harold settled into the narrow seat, he immediately felt how cramped everything was. His knees pressed against the seat in front of him, and his shoulders touched both passengers beside him. The suitcase that had caused him so much embarrassment at check-in now had to go in the overhead bin. Harold stood up again, trying to lift it above his head, but his arthritis-stiffened joints protested. The case felt much heavier than it had that morning. "Need help with that?" The voice came from behind him. Harold turned to see a young woman in her late 20s with kind eyes and a warm smile. She was dressed casually in jeans and a college sweatshirt, with her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. "Oh, that's very kind of you, but I can manage," Harold said, though his arms were already trembling from the effort. "Please let me help," the woman insisted. She was tall enough to easily reach the overhead compartment. Together they managed to get Harold's suitcase stored safely. "Thank you so much," Harold said gratefully. "I'm afraid my old bones aren't what they used to be." "No problem at all," she replied. "I'm Jessica, by the way. I'm sitting just a few rows back." "Harold," he said with a genuine smile. "It's nice to meet you, Jessica." As the plane prepared for takeoff, Harold tried to make himself comfortable, but it was nearly impossible. The seat was designed for someone much smaller and younger. His arthritic hands ached as he fumbled with the seatbelt, and the confined space made his breathing feel labored. During takeoff, Harold gripped the armrests tightly, though the businessman beside him had reclaimed them both immediately after Harold had stood up. Harold's knuckles went white as the plane climbed, not from fear of flying but from the pain shooting through his joints. Once they reached cruising altitude, things didn't get much better. The air and economy felt stale and recycling. Harold's chest began to feel tight and he found himself taking shallow breaths. He had dealt with mild breathing issues for years, but they always got worse in stressful situations or confined spaces. Harold pressed the call button for the flight attendant. After waiting several minutes, a busy-looking woman in her 30s approached his row. "Yes?" she asked curtly, clearly rushed and dealing with multiple requests. "Excuse me, miss. I was wondering if I could possibly get a glass of water. I'm having some trouble breathing and I think it might help." The flight attendant, whose name tag read Kelly, barely looked at him. "Sir, beverage service won't begin for another 30 minutes. You'll have to wait like everyone else." "I understand, but I'm feeling quite dizzy. Could I perhaps just have a small cup of water now?" Kelly sighed heavily. "Sir, we can't make exceptions for every passenger. The cart will be around soon." Harold nodded quietly, not wanting to cause any more trouble. But as Kelly walked away, Jessica had been watching from her seat a few rows back. She had seen the entire interaction and noticed how Harold was struggling. A few minutes later, Jessica appeared beside Harold's row with a small bottle of water from her own carry-on bag. "Here," she said softly, offering him the water. "You looked like you needed this." Harold's eyes filled with gratitude. "You're too kind. Thank you so much." As Harold sipped the water, Jessica noticed how his hand shook slightly, and how he seemed to be working hard just to breathe normally. "Are you feeling all right? You look a bit pale." "I'll be fine," Harold said, though he clearly wasn't. "Just not used to being cooped up like this, and I suppose I'm a bit excited about this trip." "Where are you headed?" Jessica asked, genuinely interested. Harold's whole face lit up when she asked. Despite his discomfort, his eyes sparkled with pride. "Seattle. My granddaughter is graduating from medical school tomorrow. She's going to be a doctor." "That's wonderful," Jessica said, settling into the empty aisle seat across from Harold so she could talk more easily. "You must be very proud." "Oh, you have no idea," Harold said, his voice growing stronger. "Maria is the first person in our family to become a doctor. Her parents worked 2 jobs each just to get by. When she told me she wanted to go to medical school, I knew we had to find a way to make it happen." Harold pulled out his worn wallet and carefully extracted a small photograph. It showed a young woman in a white coat, smiling brightly at the camera. This was taken when she started her residency. She's been working so hard, sometimes 18 hours a day. Jessica looked at the photo and then back at Harold. "She's beautiful, and she clearly gets her determination from her grandfather." "I just wish her grandmother could have been here to see this," Harold said quietly. "My Rosa passed away 5 years ago. She would have been so proud." As they talked, Jessica learned more about Harold's life. He told her about working as a night janitor at office buildings to save extra money, how he would finish his day job at 5 p.m., grab a quick dinner, and then work from 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. cleaning offices downtown. Then he'd go home, get a few hours of sleep, and start all over again. "I've been doing this for almost 2 years, Harold explained. "Every extra penny went into a coffee tin in my kitchen. I wanted to do something special for Maria's graduation. She's never seen me fly anywhere, never seen me have anything nice." Jessica felt a lump forming in her throat. "So you bought a business class ticket?" Harold nodded, then his face fell slightly. "Well, I tried to. There seemed to be some confusion at the airport. But that's all right. The important thing is that I'm going to be there for her big day." Jessica remembered seeing Harold at the business class counter earlier. She had been in line for her own flight when she noticed the commotion. At the time, she hadn't paid much attention, but now she was starting to piece together what had happened. "Harold," she said carefully, "what exactly happened at check-in? I thought I saw you at the business class counter." Harold shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He didn't want to complain or speak badly of anyone. "There was just a misunderstanding about my ticket. These things happen." But Jessica could tell there was more to the story. She had worked as a journalist for a small newspaper before starting graduate school, and she had developed an instinct for when something wasn't right. "Did they treat you fairly?" she asked gently. Harold was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Sometimes people look at you and make judgments. I suppose I don't look like someone who belongs in business class." Jessica felt a surge of anger. She had suspected something like this had happened, but hearing Harold confirm it made her furious. Here was a man who had worked himself to exhaustion, saving every penny to celebrate his granddaughter's incredible achievement, and he had been humiliated because of how he looked. "That's not right," Jessica said firmly. "That's not right at all." Harold patted her hand gently. "It's okay, dear. I'm here, and that's what matters. Maria doesn't know I'm coming. It's going to be a surprise. She thinks I couldn't afford to fly out." As the flight continued, Harold's breathing became more labored. The tight quarters and stress of the day were taking their toll. Jessica stayed nearby, helping him whenever she could. When the beverage cart finally came around, she made sure Harold got water right away. When he dropped his reading glasses, she retrieved them from under the seat. Other passengers in their section began to notice Jessica's kindness toward Harold. Some seemed annoyed that she was moving around and talking, but others watched with approval. One elderly woman smiled at Jessica when she helped Harold reach his bag in the overhead compartment. By the time they were preparing to land in Seattle, Harold was visibly exhausted. The cramped conditions, the stress of the earlier incident, and his excitement about seeing Maria had all combined to drain his energy. Jessica watched him with growing concern, wondering if he would be all right once they landed. The plane touched down at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport with a gentle bump. Harold had been dozing fitfully during the descent, his head resting against the small airplane window. Jessica watched him with concern as passengers around them began gathering their belongings and preparing to leave. "Harold," she said softly, touching his shoulder. "We've landed." Harold opened his eyes slowly, blinking in confusion for a moment before remembering where he was. "Oh, yes. Thank you, dear." He tried to sit up straight, but Jessica could see how much effort it took him. As passengers began filing out of the plane, Jessica helped Harold retrieve his old suitcase from the overhead compartment. She noticed how his hands trembled as he reached for it, and his breathing seemed more shallow than it had been during the flight. "Are you feeling all right?" Jessica asked as they joined the slow-moving line of passengers. "Just a bit tired," Harold replied, though his face had lost much of its color. "It's been a long day." They moved slowly through the airplane aisle and into the terminal. Harold walked carefully, using the wall for support when he could. Jessica stayed close beside him, ready to help if needed. The Seattle airport was busy with evening travelers, and the noise and crowds seemed to overwhelm Harold after the stress of his day. They had walked about halfway through the terminal when Harold suddenly stopped. He put his hand against the wall and took several deep breaths. "Harold?" Jessica said, alarm creeping into her voice. "I just need a moment," Harold said, but his voice sounded weak. Beads of sweat had formed on his forehead despite the cool air conditioning. Jessica looked around and spotted some chairs near a coffee shop. "Come on, let's sit down for a minute." She guided Harold toward the seating area, but before they could reach it, his knees gave out. Harold collapsed onto the terminal floor, his suitcase clattering beside him. "Help," Jessica called out, dropping to her knees beside Harold. "Someone call for medical assistance." Several other travelers stopped to see what was happening. A businessman pulled out his phone to call for help, while a woman who identified herself as a nurse hurried over to check on Harold. "Sir, can you hear me?" the nurse asked, feeling for Harold's pulse. "What's your name?" "Harold," he whispered, his eyes fluttering open. "I'm okay, really. Just got a bit dizzy." Within minutes, airport paramedics arrived with a wheelchair and a medical kit. They checked Harold's vital signs and determined that he was suffering from dehydration and exhaustion, but nothing immediately life-threatening. "We should take him to the airport medical center for observation," one of the paramedics suggested. "Is that really necessary?" Harold asked weakly. "My granddaughter's graduation is tomorrow morning. I can't miss it." Jessica squeezed Harold's hand. "The medical center is just to make sure you're okay. I'll stay with you." As they wheeled Harold to the medical facility, Jessica grabbed his suitcase and walked alongside. She found herself wondering about this kind old man who had worked so hard just to see his granddaughter graduate. Something about his story touched her deeply, and she was determined to help him however she could. At the medical center, Harold was given fluids and allowed to rest on a comfortable bed. The nurse on duty said he would need to stay for a couple of hours to make sure he was stable. Harold protested, worried about missing his hotel check-in time, but Jessica assured him she would help with whatever he needed. "Harold," Jessica said, sitting in the chair beside his bed, "I need to contact someone for you. Do you have your granddaughter's phone number?" Harold nodded toward his jacket pocket. "My phone is in there. Her name is Maria Santos. She's in my contacts." Jessica carefully retrieved Harold's phone. It was an older model, well used but clean. As she scrolled through his contacts to find Maria's number, she couldn't help but notice some of the other names in his phone. There were entries for Downtown Medical Center, Children's Hospital Foundation, and University Scholarship Office. Before calling Maria, Jessica decided to step outside and use her own phone to search for more information about Harold. She wanted to make sure Maria would understand the seriousness of the situation, and she thought it might help to know more about Harold's background. She typed Harold Martinez Seattle into her phone's search engine, not expecting to find much. After all, he seemed like a quiet, humble man who kept to himself, but what appeared on her screen made her stop breathing for a moment. The first result was a news article from 15 years ago. "Local businessman donates fortune to medical education." Below that was another headline. "Martinez Medical Technologies founder gives away millions to help students become doctors." Jessica's hands shook as she clicked on the first article. The photo that loaded showed a younger Harold Martinez standing in front of a large building with Martinez Medical Technologies written across the front. The article explained how Harold had founded a company that developed life-saving surgical equipment used in hospitals around the world. But that wasn't the shocking part. The article went on to describe how Harold had sold his company for an enormous sum of money, then quietly donated nearly all of it to create scholarship funds for students who couldn't afford medical school. Harold Martinez, 63, says he started his company with a simple goal: to help doctors save more lives, the article quoted. "Now, by helping young people become doctors, I hope to save even more lives in the future." Jessica scrolled through more search results, finding article after article about Harold's generosity. There were photos of him at scholarship ceremonies standing with young medical students who were receiving funding for their education. One article mentioned that he had personally funded the education of over 150 medical students in the first 10 years alone. Another search result showed a more recent article from just 3 years ago. The headline read, "Quiet Hero Continues Mission. Local Man Still Funding Medical Dreams at Age 75. The article described how Harold, after donating most of his fortune, had taken a job as a janitor to stay active and continue earning money for his scholarship fund. "I don't need much for myself," Harold was quoted as saying, "but there are always more young people who dream of becoming doctors. I want to help as many as I can." Jessica sat down heavily on a bench outside the medical center, overwhelmed by what she had discovered. The humble, kind man she had met on the airplane wasn't just any grandfather celebrating his granddaughter's graduation. He was Harold Martinez, a man who had given away millions of dollars to help others achieve their dreams of becoming doctors. And his own granddaughter, Maria, was graduating from medical school the next day. Jessica wondered if Maria had any idea that her grandfather's sacrifices had helped dozens of other students just like her. She scrolled through more articles and found references to the Martinez Medical Scholarship program at several universities. There were testimonials from doctors who credited Harold with making their careers possible. One doctor wrote, "Mr. Martinez didn't just pay for my education. He changed my entire life and made it possible for me to help thousands of patients." Jessica also discovered that Harold's company had developed several pieces of medical equipment that were still being used in operating rooms worldwide. The articles mentioned that his innovations had contributed to saving countless lives over the years. As she continued reading, Jessica found a video interview Harold had given to a local news station 5 years earlier. In it, he spoke quietly about his motivation. "My late wife Rosa and I were never blessed with children of our own until later in life. When we finally had a family, we realized how lucky we were. We wanted to help other families have the same opportunities." The interviewer had asked Harold why he chose to fund medical education specifically. His answer brought tears to Jessica's eyes. "Doctors save lives every single day. If I can help create more doctors, then maybe some part of Rosa and me will keep saving lives long after we're gone." Jessica realized that Harold's current job as a night janitor wasn't just about staying active. The articles mentioned that he continued to contribute every penny of his janitor wages to his scholarship fund, even at age 78. She looked back toward the medical center where Harold was resting. This man, who had been treated with such disrespect at the airport, who had been judged because of his simple clothes and old suitcase, had quietly changed hundreds of lives. He had given away a fortune that most people could only dream of, and he was still working tirelessly to help others. The most incredible part was that Harold seemed to have no interest in recognition or praise. All the articles mentioned how difficult it had been to get him to agree to interviews. He preferred to let his actions speak for themselves. Jessica knew she had to tell this story. The world needed to know about Harold Martinez and how he had been treated. But first, she needed to make sure he was okay and help him get to his granddaughter's graduation. She walked back into the medical center, her mind racing with everything she had learned. Harold was sitting up in bed looking much better after receiving fluids and rest. "How are you feeling?" Jessica asked, trying to keep her voice normal despite her shock at discovering who he really was. "Much better, thank you." Harold smiled. "You've been so kind to me. I hope I haven't ruined your evening." Jessica looked at this humble, generous man and felt overwhelmed with emotion. "Harold," she said carefully, "you haven't ruined anything. In fact, I think meeting you might have been the most important thing that's happened to me in a very long time." After Harold was discharged from the airport medical center that evening, Jessica helped him get to his hotel. She made sure he had everything he needed for the night, including a good meal and plenty of water. Harold was grateful for her kindness, but had no idea that Jessica was planning something that would change everything. That night, Jessica sat in her own hotel room with her laptop open, unable to sleep. She kept thinking about Harold's treatment at the airport and what she had discovered about his incredible background. As someone who had studied journalism in college and worked for a local newspaper, she knew injustice when she saw it. She started by calling the airline's customer service line. After being transferred several times, she finally reached someone in their corporate office. "I witnessed discrimination against an elderly passenger today," Jessica explained to the representative. "He had a legitimate business class ticket, but was forced to sit in economy because your staff didn't believe he belonged there." The airline representative, who introduced himself as Robert, sounded tired and defensive. "Ma'am, our staff follows strict procedures. If there was an issue with a ticket, I'm sure they handled it appropriately." "The ticket wasn't the issue," Jessica pressed. "Your staff made assumptions based on how this man looked. They treated him terribly in front of other passengers." "I'd be happy to take down the passenger's information and look into this," Robert said, though his tone suggested he was just going through the motions. Jessica gave them Harold's name and flight details, but she could tell they weren't taking her seriously. After she hung up, she realized she needed to approach this differently. She spent the next few hours researching everything she could find about Harold Martinez. The more she read, the more amazed she became. Here was a man who had built a successful medical technology company from nothing, then given away nearly his entire fortune to help young people become doctors. Jessica found records showing that Harold's scholarship program had funded over 200 medical students over the past 15 years. Many of these students had gone on to become prominent doctors, researchers, and medical professors. She read testimonials from recipients who said Harold's generosity had completely changed their lives. One story particularly moved her. A doctor named Patricia Williams had written about how Harold's scholarship had allowed her to attend medical school after her family lost everything in a house fire. She was now the head of pediatric surgery at a major children's hospital. "Mr. Martinez didn't just pay for my education," she had written. "He made it possible for me to save children's lives every day." By morning, Jessica had compiled a detailed file about Harold's background. She also had an idea that might help bring attention to what had happened to him. The next step was contacting Harold's granddaughter, Maria. Jessica found her contact information through the university where Maria was graduating. She called early in the morning hoping to catch Maria before the graduation ceremony. "Hello, this is Maria Santos," came a tired but cheerful voice. "Hi, Maria. My name is Jessica Chen. I was on the same flight as your grandfather yesterday. Is this a good time to talk?" There was immediate concern in Maria's voice. "My grandfather, is he okay?" He didn't tell me he was coming to my graduation. Jessica smiled. He wanted to surprise you. But yes, he's fine now. He had a little episode at the airport yesterday from exhaustion, but he's recovered. Oh my goodness, Maria said. I had no idea he was planning to come. He told me he couldn't afford the trip. Maria, there are some things about your grandfather that I think you should know, Jessica said gently. But first I want to ask, do you know about his past? About his company and his scholarship program? There was a long pause. You mean his work as a janitor? He's been working nights to save money. He's the most generous person I know, always helping other people even when he doesn't have much. Jessica realized that Maria had no idea about her grandfather's true background. Maria, your grandfather isn't just a janitor. He's Harold Martinez, the founder of Martinez Medical Technologies. He gave away millions of dollars to help students like you go to medical school. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Jessica wondered if the call had been dropped. That's impossible, Maria finally whispered. My grandfather works as a janitor. He lives in a small apartment and drives an old car. Jessica spent the next 20 minutes explaining everything she had discovered. She told Maria about the scholarship program, the medical technology company, and the hundreds of students Harold had helped over the years. He's been working as a janitor by choice, Jessica explained. Every penny he earns still goes to help other students. He's been funding medical educations for 15 years, Maria. Your graduation today represents everything he's worked for. Maria was crying by the time Jessica finished. I can't believe this. He never told me any of this. He just kept saying how proud he was that I was going to be a doctor. There's more, Jessica said. Yesterday, the airline staff treated him terribly. They refused to honor his business class ticket because they didn't think he looked like he belonged there. They humiliated him in front of other passengers. Maria's sadness quickly turned to anger. They did what? Jessica described everything she had witnessed at the airport. She told Maria about Linda Patterson and David Chen, the staff members who had forced Harold to sit in economy despite his legitimate ticket. This man has probably saved more lives through his scholarship program than most doctors ever will, Jessica said, and they treated him like he was trying to scam them. Maria was quiet for a moment, then said, Jessica, I work for the university newspaper, and I have contacts at several major news outlets. Would you be willing to tell this story publicly? That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say, Jessica replied. Over the next several hours, working together by phone and email, Jessica and Maria put together a comprehensive story about what had happened to Harold. Maria provided documentation about her grandfather's scholarship program and contacted some of the doctors who had benefited from his generosity. Dr. Patricia Williams, the pediatric surgeon Harold had helped years earlier, was one of the first to respond. Mr. Martinez changed my entire life, she told Jessica over the phone. He's a quiet hero who has helped hundreds of people become doctors. The fact that anyone treated him with disrespect is absolutely outrageous. By afternoon, just hours before Maria's graduation ceremony, Jessica had contacted 3 major news outlets. The story was too compelling to ignore. A millionaire philanthropist who gave away his fortune to help medical students, now working as a janitor and still contributing every penny to scholarships, had been discriminated against by airline staff who judged him by his appearance. The first news story went online just as Maria's graduation ceremony was beginning. The headline read, Airline discriminates against elderly man who secretly funded hundreds of medical students. Within hours, the story was spreading across social media. People were sharing articles about Harold's incredible generosity and expressing outrage about his treatment at the airport. The hashtag #ChoikerJusticeForHarold began trending on social platforms. Dr. Williams shared the story with her colleagues at the Children's Hospital. Many of them recognized Harold's name from medical equipment his company had developed. Soon, doctors from across the country were sharing their own stories about how Harold's innovations and scholarships had impacted their careers and their ability to help patients. The airline's social media accounts were flooded with angry comments from people demanding an explanation. Passengers who had witnessed the incident at the airport began coming forward to confirm Jessica's account of what had happened. A video journalist managed to track down security footage from the airport that showed Harold's treatment at the business class counter. The footage clearly showed Linda Patterson dismissing Harold without properly examining his ticket. and it captured the humiliation on Harold's face as other passengers stared and whispered. By evening, the story had been picked up by major television news networks. Harold Martinez had become a household name overnight, but not in the way he would have preferred. Throughout all of this media attention, Harold remained focused on what mattered most to him, Maria's graduation ceremony. Jessica attended the ceremony with him, watching as this humble man beamed with pride when his granddaughter walked across the stage to receive her medical degree. Harold had no idea that his story was spreading across the country, or that people everywhere were demanding justice for the way he had been treated. He was simply a grandfather celebrating the proudest moment of his life, watching his granddaughter achieve her dream of becoming a doctor. But even as Harold enjoyed Maria's graduation, the consequences of the airline's discrimination were just beginning to unfold. The story Jessica had started was now bigger than anyone could have imagined, and it would soon force the airline to face serious consequences for their actions. Jessica watched Harold during the graduation ceremony, seeing the pure joy on his face as he applauded for Maria. She knew that tomorrow would bring difficult conversations and media attention for this private man who preferred to help others quietly. But she also knew that sometimes the most important stories are the ones about ordinary people doing extraordinary things, and how they deserve to be treated with dignity and respect, no matter how they look. The morning after Maria's graduation ceremony, Harold woke up in his hotel room to find dozens of missed calls on his old phone. He sat on the edge of the bed, confused and slightly worried. Had something happened to someone he knew? Jessica had promised to meet him for breakfast before their flights back home, so Harold got dressed in his simple clothes and went down to the hotel restaurant. When the elevator doors opened, he was surprised to see several people in the lobby staring at him and whispering to each other. "Excuse me, are you Harold Martinez?" asked a woman approaching him with her phone out. Harold nodded, still confused. "Yes, but I'm sorry, do we know each other?" "Sir, you're all over the news," the woman said excitedly. "You're a hero." Before Harold could ask what she meant, Jessica appeared at his side. She gently guided him away from the growing crowd in the lobby. "Harold, we need to talk," Jessica said softly. "Let's go somewhere quiet." They found a small seating area near the hotel's business center. Jessica sat down across from Harold and took a deep breath. "I need to tell you something," she began.
"Yesterday, after I learned about your background and what happened to you at the airport, I contacted some news outlets."
"Your story has spread everywhere." Harold looked puzzled. "My story? People know who you really are now, Harold. They know about your company, your scholarship program, and how you've helped hundreds of students become doctors, and they're furious about how the airline treated you." Jessica showed Harold her phone, scrolling through news articles with headlines like "Millionaire Philanthropist Discriminated Against by Airline" and "The Janitor Who Secretly Changed Medicine Forever." Harold stared at the screen, his face growing pale. "Oh my," he said quietly. "I never wanted this kind of attention." "I know," Jessica said gently. "But Harold, what happened to you was wrong. People needed to know." As if on cue, Harold's phone rang. The caller ID showed it was from the airline's corporate headquarters. Harold answered hesitantly. "Mr. Martinez, this is Thomas Bradford, CEO of the airline," came a nervous voice. "Sir, I am calling to offer you my most sincere apologies for the treatment you received at our Chicago counter. Yesterday, Harold listened as the CEO explained that they had reviewed the security footage and were taking immediate action. Linda Patterson, the supervisor who had refused to honor Harold's ticket, had been terminated that morning. David Chen, her colleague, was being suspended pending further investigation. Mr. Martinez, we would like to offer you lifetime first-class travel on our airline, along with compensation for the distress you experienced, the CEO continued. That's very kind of you, Harold said, still processing everything that was happening. But I'm not sure all this fuss is necessary. Sir, with all due respect, it is absolutely necessary. Your story has opened our eyes to problems in our customer service training. We're implementing new policies immediately to ensure this never happens again. After Harold ended the call, Jessica could see he was overwhelmed by all the attention. Are you okay? She asked. I've spent 15 years trying to help people quietly, Harold said. I never wanted to be famous or have people make a big deal about what I do. Harold, sometimes the world needs to hear about people like you. Your story is inspiring others to be more generous, more kind, and to treat everyone with respect. Over the next few hours, Harold's phone kept ringing. There were calls from newspaper reporters, television producers, and medical schools wanting to interview him. But the calls that meant the most to him were from some of the doctors whose education he had funded over the years. Dr. Patricia Williams, the pediatric surgeon, called to tell Harold how the news coverage had led to a flood of donations to medical scholarship funds at universities across the country. "Your story is inspiring a whole new generation of people to help students achieve their dreams," she told him. Another call came from Dr. Michael Thompson, who had received one of Harold's first scholarships 15 years ago. He was now the chief of emergency medicine at a major hospital. "Mr. Martinez, I've been trying to find you for years to thank you properly. Because of your generosity, I've been able to save thousands of lives. Now I want to help you continue your mission." As the day went on, something beautiful began to happen. Medical schools started announcing new scholarship programs inspired by Harold's example. Successful doctors who had benefited from his funding began contributing to scholarship funds themselves. Corporate executives reached out offering to support his work. But perhaps the most touching call came from Maria, who was flying back to her residency program that afternoon. "Grandpa," she said, her voice filled with emotion, "I finally understand why you always told me that becoming a doctor was about more than just helping individual patients. You've been changing the entire medical field, one student at a time. Maria, sweetheart, I just wanted to help young people like you achieve their dreams," Harold replied, his own voice shaking with emotion. "You've done so much more than that," Maria said, "and now, because people know your story, even more students will get help. Your impact is going to grow exponentially." That afternoon, Harold was invited to speak at the medical school where Maria had just graduated. When he arrived, he was shocked to see the auditorium packed with students, faculty, and local doctors. Many of them were people whose careers he had made possible through his scholarship program. Harold had never been comfortable with public speaking, but as he stood at the podium looking out at all the faces, he felt a sense of purpose. "I'm not sure why everyone is making such a fuss about an old janitor," he began, getting some gentle laughter from the audience. "But if my story can teach us anything, I hope it's this. Every person deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of how they look or what job they have." Harold went on to talk about his late wife, Rosa, and how they had always believed in the power of education to change lives. "Rosa and I were blessed to be able to help some of you achieve your dreams. But the real heroes are all of you, the doctors, nurses, and medical professionals who save lives every day." The audience gave Harold a standing ovation that lasted for several minutes. When it finally died down, the dean of the medical school announced that they were establishing the Harold and Rosa Martinez Scholarship Hall in their honor. But Harold wasn't finished with his surprises. He had accepted the airline's offer of lifetime first-class travel, but with a condition that amazed everyone. "I've asked the airline to create a program," Harold announced. "Medical students and residents traveling to internships, conferences, or job interviews can apply for free first-class upgrades. I want to make sure that the next generation of doctors can travel with the dignity they deserve." The airline enthusiastically agreed to the program, seeing it as a way to repair their reputation while supporting an important cause. As the event concluded, Jessica watched Harold being surrounded by grateful students and doctors. She realized that what had started as a simple act of airline discrimination had turned into something much larger, a celebration of quiet generosity and a reminder that heroes often look nothing like what we expect. Later that evening, as Harold and Jessica waited for their flights at the Seattle airport, Harold reflected on the whirlwind day. "You know, Jessica, maybe Rosa would have approved of all this attention after all," he said with a small smile. "If it helps more young people become doctors, then perhaps it was meant to happen." "I think she would be very proud of you," Jessica replied. As Harold boarded his flight home, in first class this time, though he had initially tried to refuse the upgrade, he carried with him dozens of business cards from doctors wanting to contribute to scholarship programs. His simple plan to quietly attend his granddaughter's graduation had turned into a movement that would help hundreds. More students achieve their medical dreams. The airline staff on Harold's return flight treated him like royalty, but Harold remained his humble, gracious self. He spent the flight talking with a young passenger who was headed to her first year of medical school, sharing encouragement and advice. When Harold finally arrived home and unlocked his small apartment, he found it filled with flowers and cards from people across the country who had been touched by his story. But the item that meant the most to him was a simple handwritten note from Maria. "Grandpa, thank you for showing me what it really means to be a doctor. I love you." Harold Martinez had lived most of his life as a quiet hero, helping others without seeking recognition. In the end, when recognition found him anyway, he used it to help even more people. And perhaps that's the most beautiful part of all, that even when the spotlight shines on true kindness, it only grows brighter.